"You're just another loud soldier playing politics." Those were the words hurled at 35-year-old Ibrahim Traoré during a tense African Union summit in Addis Ababa. Misunderstood, cornered, and labeled as a troublemaker for challenging a Western-backed resolution, he stood alone, angry and unheard. Whispers of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, even legal action loomed. But what happened next no one expected. Instead of retaliation, a calm voice cut through the storm. President Samia Suluhu of Tanzania didn't lecture him, she told him a story. And in that moment, Traoré didn't just hear wisdom. He felt it. The rage that had fueled his fire was about to transform into something far more powerful. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like the video to support our work. Share it with others who believe in true leadership and resilience. And if you want to keep following the journey of Captain Ibrahim Traoré and other brave voices shaping Africa's future, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a moment of truth, courage, and transformation. At the 2023 African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, tension hung heavy in the air. Leaders from across the continent had gathered to discuss a controversial resolution, one that, on the surface, appeared to promote regional stability. But to Captain Ibrahim Traoré, it reeked of Western influence hidden beneath diplomatic language. When he stood to speak, he didn't hold back. He challenged the legitimacy of the document, calling it a leash disguised as partnership. His voice, though passionate, was seen by many as disruptive. Within minutes, whispers spread across the hall. A senior official leaned toward another and muttered, "He's too emotional, too reckless to be here." Others nodded. Some accused Traoré of undermining the unity of the summit. A few even mentioned that his statements could be grounds for formal censure, possibly even legal consequences. The word sanction floated through the corridors as his name became a cautionary example of how not to behave in high-level diplomacy. For many in that room, he was no longer a rising leader, they saw him as a liability. But the misunderstanding ran deeper than protocol. Traoré wasn't lashing out for attention. He was voicing the frustration of a generation tired of double standards, of seeing Africa treated as a chessboard by external powers. His words came from lived experience, not rebellion. Still, no one asked why he felt so strongly. They simply labeled him, angry, unrefined, dangerous. After the session ended, as others avoided eye contact or hurried past, one person did the opposite. President Samia Suluhu, the calm and composed leader of Tanzania, quietly approached Traoré. "Stay for a moment," she said. There was no reprimand in her tone, just curiosity, maybe even empathy. She didn't question his outburst. Instead, she told him a story. She spoke of her early days in politics, of sitting in rooms where her presence as a woman was either ignored or patronized. She recounted being talked over, doubted, and dismissed. But instead of shouting louder, she had chosen to speak wiser. "Sometimes," she said gently, "we must let our stillness make the noise." Traoré stood silent, unsure how to respond. Her words didn't rebuke him, they disarmed him. In that brief exchange, something shifted. The man who had entered the summit ready for battle was now hearing an entirely different language, the language of grace. For the first time, he saw that strength could be quiet. That leadership wasn't always about volume, but presence. What began as a moment of public humiliation transformed into a private revelation. Traoré wasn't wrong for caring, but maybe, just maybe, he needed to learn how to be heard. The silence that followed Samia Suluhu's words was not empty, it was transformative. Ibrahim Traoré stood motionless, his jaw still tight from the confrontation minutes earlier, but something in his gaze had softened. Her voice, gentle yet unshakably firm, had cut through the noise in his mind. Unlike the dismissive tones of the other leaders, her words didn't seek to tame him, they sought to teach him. As they sat in a quiet corner outside the main hall, Samia didn't try to overpower his convictions. Instead, she asked questions. "What did you see in that resolution?" she inquired. Traore, still cautious, replied with the frustration he had carried for years. He spoke of military aid laced with conditions, of foreign partnerships that weakened sovereignty, and of how young African leaders were expected to obey, not challenge. He expected her to argue back, but she didn't. She nodded, listening, absorbing every word. Then she told him about her own version of that same struggle. How, as a young politician in Tanzania, her decisions were questioned more for her gender than their content. She had learned that patience was not passivity, it was endurance. She recalled moments when she had to swallow pride, not because she was weak, but because she had chosen a longer road, one paved with quiet resilience. "I learned to speak softly," she said, "so they would have to lean in to hear me." The contrast between them was striking. Where Traore had chosen fire, she had chosen stillness. Yet, both were shaped by the same root, resistance. Her story did not invalidate his, it reframed it. He began to see that anger wasn't the only answer to injustice. That wisdom, too, could be a weapon. They sat there, two generations of African leadership, the young revolutionary and the seasoned reformer, bridging a gap that had seemed unbridgeable. For the first time since the summit began, Traore didn't feel alone. He felt seen. Not as a threat. Not as a mistake. But as a man still learning what kind of leader he wanted to become. By the time they stood up, something inside him had shifted. The rage still burned, but it no longer blinded him. It was no longer about proving himself right, it was about learning how to lead without burning bridges. Samia didn't give him orders. She didn't offer solutions. What she gave him was something far more powerful, the example of calm defiance and the proof that dignity need not be loud to echo through history. As they walked back into the summit hall, side by side, Ibrahim Traoré no longer looked like the outsider who had broken protocol. He looked like a man who had just discovered a deeper form of strength, one that didn't roar, but resonated. Back inside the summit chamber, the atmosphere remained tense. The delegates had resumed discussions, but whispers still circulated about Ibrahim Traoré's earlier confrontation. Some looked at him with suspicion, others with thinly veiled contempt. The label of disruptive still clung to him like smoke. Yet, as he took his seat, he carried himself differently, not with the defiant energy of a man on the verge of war, but with the grounded calm of someone who had just learned the weight of silence. This change didn't go unnoticed. One delegate, who had earlier threatened to file a formal complaint against Traoré for violating the summit's decorum, leaned toward a colleague and asked, "Did something happen outside?" But no one could pinpoint what had changed. The fire was still in Traoré's eyes, but it no longer flared recklessly. It smoldered with purpose. When given the chance to speak again, Traoré stood slowly. The room braced for another outburst. Instead, his voice came steady and deliberate. He addressed the same resolution he had previously condemned but framed his objections with clarity, not condemnation. He questioned not only the content but the assumptions beneath it. He asked why Africa's partnerships were always conditioned, why independence was still negotiated like a favor, not a right. He paused, not for dramatic effect, but to let the weight of his words settle. And then, echoing what he had just learned, he said, "Strength is not always in how loud we speak, but in how deeply we're heard." A silence swept through the room, not awkward, but reflective. For the first time, even his critics listened without interruption. His words no longer triggered defensive walls, they prompted thought. Some faces softened. Others looked down, uncomfortable with the mirror he held up. President Samia Suluhu didn't interrupt. She didn't nod. She simply observed, knowing the transformation unfolding wasn't hers to claim, but his to own. He wasn't just repeating her wisdom, he was living it. Traore ended his speech not with a dramatic gesture, but with a final, quiet sentence: Africa's dignity cannot be negotiated behind closed doors. It must be declared, patiently, face to face. It wasn't a concession. It was evolution. After the session, a few delegates who had earlier avoided him approached. Their tone was no longer dismissive, it was cautious, even respectful. One of them extended a hand and said, "That was unexpected." Traore simply nodded, not with pride, but with restraint. He had learned that validation didn't need to be seized, it would come in time, if one had the discipline to wait for it. What had started as a moment of near disgrace was now the seed of something more enduring. Not because Traore surrendered, but because he discovered another way to stand tall, without shouting, without bowing. Just standing. Firm, and finally, heard. In the days following the summit, the story of Ibrahim Traoré's confrontation, and his transformation, spread across diplomatic circles in whispers and headlines. Many who had initially dismissed him as hot-headed were now forced to reevaluate their judgment. The very man some had wanted silenced had returned home more composed, more deliberate, and more determined than ever. But the true shift was not just political, it was personal. Back in Burkina Faso, Traore convened a closed-door meeting with his closest advisors. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he asked a question that surprised everyone: what does strength look like when no one is watching? The room fell silent. This wasn't the man they remembered, fiery, impatient, always ready to confront. Something about him had changed. His voice no longer demanded attention, it invited it. He shared with them not just the events of the summit, but the moment that had pierced through his pride, Samia Suluhu's story. He recounted her words, her stillness, and the way her quiet dignity had forced him to see his reflection more clearly. For the first time, he admitted that while his intentions had been righteous, his methods had sometimes mirrored the very force he sought to resist. "I don't want to be feared," he told them. "I want to be trusted." That meeting sparked a new chapter in his leadership. Traore began to adopt a slower, more intentional rhythm in his decisions. He still fought for justice, still challenged imperialist narratives, but he no longer let anger speak first. Instead of calling out opponents in public, he started inviting them to talk in private. Instead of using fire to win debates, he used strategy to win minds. This internal transformation didn't go unnoticed. In one regional forum, a senior minister who had once called him a ticking time bomb approached him with a quiet apology. "I judged your voice, not your vision," the minister said. Traore accepted the words with grace, no longer needing the upper hand to feel victorious. Even his critics in the international community, while still wary of his anti-colonial rhetoric, began to acknowledge the nuance in his leadership. They saw a man who could hold firm without exploding, who could speak harsh truths without hostility. And that balance, so rare in modern politics, made him not only more effective but more dangerous to those who thrived on chaos and division. Traore never forgot the lesson. He would repeat it often to young cadets and future diplomats: if your voice is too loud, they'll hear the noise, not the message. But if your silence holds weight, they'll lean in, and that's when they truly listen. What began as a misunderstanding, a threat of censure, and the sting of public rejection had become the crucible in which a new kind of leader was forged. Not by force. Not by fear. But by wisdom, earned the hard way. Months after the summit, the echoes of that pivotal moment between Ibrahim Traoré and Samia Suluhu continued to ripple across the region. The story had become more than an anecdote, it was now a reference point for a new style of leadership, one that rejected both submission and rage. Yet, not everyone welcomed this shift. Some of Traoré's own allies began to question his evolving tone. They mistook his newfound calm for compromise. They feared he was softening. In one particularly tense meeting, a fellow officer confronted him directly. "Are we not at war?" he asked. "Why act like a diplomat when the enemy sharpens their knives?" The words were laced with disappointment, almost accusation. For a moment, Traoré stared back, expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he responded, "You do not win every war with a sword. You win by refusing to let your anger make you a mirror of your enemy." That response did not silence all critics, but it set the tone. Traoré was no longer the man who reacted first. He had become the man who chose when to react, and how. The strength he projected now came not from volume, but from presence. And ironically, it made his enemies more nervous than before. A man who acts out of rage is predictable. A man who listens before he strikes is dangerous. This evolution wasn't confined to policy meetings or summits. Traoré began mentoring younger officers in the military academy, not just in tactics but in temperament. He introduced weekly sessions where cadets reflected on restraint, diplomacy, and emotional intelligence. Some resisted. Others thrived. But all of them saw a leader who practiced what he preached. During a diplomatic visit to Senegal, one journalist asked him what had caused the sudden shift in his political posture. Was it pressure from the West? She hinted. He smiled slightly, then replied, no. It was a conversation with someone who knew how to lead without shouting. He never mentioned Samia's name publicly, but her influence was woven into his choices, his pauses, his silences. And while many expected the fire in him to fade, it didn't. It simply burned cleaner, sharper. His speeches grew shorter but more impactful. His actions spoke louder than any condemnation. People listened, not because he demanded obedience, but because he had become the kind of leader who made them believe again. The misunderstanding that once marked him as a liability had become the foundation of his transformation. The insult that nearly erased his credibility now stood as the turning point in his legacy. In every room he entered, Ibrahim Traoré carried that moment like armor, not to protect him from others, but to remind himself of who he had chosen to become, a leader forged not in applause, but in silence, grace, and unexpected wisdom. The most powerful lessons in leadership often come not from grand speeches or triumphant victories, but from moments of unexpected stillness, when one is forced to confront themselves in the face of misunderstanding, rejection, or humiliation. Such was the case for Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a fiery young leader known for his unapologetic defense of African sovereignty, who entered a room ready to fight but walked away having discovered something far greater than victory, wisdom. At the core of Traoré's transformation lies a universal truth: not every battle is won by shouting louder. In a world where voices compete for dominance and volume is mistaken for power, we often forget the potency of restraint. Traoré had every reason to erupt at the African Union Summit. He saw injustice, manipulation, and the subtle fingerprints of neo-colonial pressure wrapped in diplomatic language. He spoke his truth, but the room didn't hear it. They only heard his anger. And therein lies the first lesson: if you want people to hear your message, you must speak in a language they can receive. Traoré's confrontation with legal threats, public criticism, and political alienation could have hardened him. Many in his position would have doubled down, defending themselves louder, burning bridges out of wounded pride. But fate had another teacher waiting, President Samia Suluhu. Her calm, maternal presence did not scold or shame. She offered no debate, only a mirror. She told her story, not to preach, but to share. Her words didn't push back against Traoré's anger, they offered it a place to rest. This moment revealed a second lesson: true leadership is not the absence of emotion, but the mastery of it. Traore did not need to erase his passion or abandon his convictions. What he needed was direction, a new way to channel his fire. Through SULUHU's example, he began to understand that dignity is not measured by how forcefully you speak, but by how deeply you are felt. Silence, when chosen intentionally, carries more weight than 1,000 loud arguments. The third lesson emerged as Traore returned to his people and his position of power. Change is not always met with applause. Sometimes, your evolution will confuse or even anger those closest to you. His allies questioned his softer tone. His enemies tested his patience. But Traore held the line, not out of weakness, but because he had learned that patience is a weapon far more lethal than rage. This kind of restraint requires far more courage than confrontation. And those who mistake it for surrender often fail to see the strength it takes to stay silent when the world demands a roar. Traore's transformation wasn't about pleasing others or avoiding conflict. It was about becoming the kind of man whose presence could disarm conflict without uttering a threat. In doing so, he uncovered a fourth and more subtle lesson: your influence grows not when you impose your will, but when you invite others into your calm. Whether speaking to soldiers, foreign leaders, or the youth of Burkina Faso, he no longer raised his voice to command authority, he lowered it, so they would lean in. And they did. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of all is this: humiliation can be a gift, if you are humble enough to accept it. What began as an insult at a political summit, a young man branded as reckless, became the catalyst for inner growth. Traore was not destroyed by that moment, he was remade. Because he did not run from the discomfort. He sat with it. He listened. And in listening, he discovered a path forward that few leaders are brave enough to walk. This story teaches us that resilience is not found in resistance alone. It is found in reflection. In every misunderstanding, every insult, and every moment of exclusion, there is a hidden opportunity to evolve, if we are willing to stop reacting and start responding. Samia Suluhu never raised her voice, yet she changed the course of a rising leader's journey. That is the quiet power of grace. We live in an era that rewards noise. Social media algorithms favor outrage. Politicians win points for aggression. But Traore's story offers an antidote. Leadership rooted in emotional intelligence, in listening deeply before speaking boldly, in refusing to let rage define one's legacy. That kind of leadership doesn't fade with headlines. It endures. For anyone seeking to lead, in politics, in family, in personal growth, the lesson is clear. Passion is not enough. Clarity is not enough. Even righteousness is not enough. What matters is how we carry these things. Do we wield them like weapons, or do we carry them like tools? Do we impose, or do we inspire? Traore chose the harder road, to inspire through restraint, to fight with dignity, and T.'s voice in the room isn't always the strongest. Sometimes, it's the quiet one, the one that speaks last, but speaks with truth, depth, and unshakable calm, that shapes the future. Many viewers were deeply moved by the story, expressing admiration for both Traore's transformation and President Samia Suluhu's wisdom. One viewer wrote that the moment between them restored their faith in African leadership, adding that in a world dominated by ego and noise, seeing a young man humbled by a woman's quiet strength was not just powerful, it was necessary. Another comment echoed that sentiment, calling Suluhu's presence the embodiment of soft power, and praising her for showing that real influence comes not from dominance but from dignity. Several audience members identified personally with Traore's struggle. One viewer, a young activist, said they had often been dismissed for being too loud, too radical, too emotional, and found hope in seeing someone like Traore learn how to channel passion without losing its edge. He didn't give in, they said. He grew. Others commented that the story reminded them of elders in their own communities who had taught them the same lesson: speak so others will listen, not just so they'll hear you. Some viewers highlighted the gender dynamics at play, applauding the way President SULUHU handled the situation. One woman wrote, "This is why we need more women in leadership, not to replace men, but to balance them." Another added, "She didn't demand respect. She earned it, and then passed it on without asking for credit." Her calm, measured approach sparked conversations in the comments about the value of feminine leadership in high-stakes diplomacy. Not all comments were sentimental. A few challenged the idea that Traore's restraint was entirely positive. One critic wondered whether too much patience might lead to political inaction. Injustice requires fire, they argued. But fire without control is just destruction. However, even these critiques acknowledged the depth of Traore's transformation and the symbolic importance of him learning from someone so unlike himself. Many saw the encounter as a metaphor for Africa's future. One viewer wrote, "This is not just about two leaders, it's about two paths, confrontation versus conversation. And maybe, just maybe, the conversation path is finally starting to win." Another commented, "If we had more exchanges like this, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, our continent would be unstoppable." Across the board, the most repeated phrase in the comments section was simple but profound: "I felt that." People weren't just reacting to the politics, they were reacting to the humanity. The humility of Traore, the grace of SULUHU, and the power of that quiet moment resonated far beyond Burkina Faso or Tanzania. It reminded people that leadership isn't just about speeches and titles, it's about growth, connection, and the courage to evolve. In the end, viewers didn't just walk away with admiration. They walked away with a lesson, one they could apply in their own lives, in their own conflicts. And that, more than anything, was the legacy of this story.